Okay, welcome. In this tutorial, we are going to go ahead and from our extremely limited introduction to HTML, and we are going to jump right into cascading style sheets or CSS. And the reason we're doing that is because once we understand the concepts for how to apply styling to a tag in HTML, we can go ahead and learn additional tags in HTML and apply styling to those because the rules don't change. We'll look at some resources for different properties that we can adjust with CSS for the different tags or the different elements on the page in our document. But the idea, the syntax, all of that remains the same. And there's a lot of exciting tags that we have to introduce. And in the next tutorial, I'm actually going to show you how to use CSS to essentially recreate like a layered image or a layered scene in just HTML and CSS and actually animate some of the elements of that using styling. So we can really start to get rolling on ways to use this as an art making tool. So in a lot of tutorials, it's really based on creating a clear and functional site that conveys information in a linear or whatever fashion. Whereas the way that I'm structuring these tutorials is so that you're thinking about this as an art making tool and as a way to you're going to have this tool set of HTML and CSS, and how you play with that, how you mix these things together, and how you hopefully make a lot of mistakes that create really crazy or beautiful or interesting compositions is a part of this process. And it's a way that a lot of people don't talk about how to use HTML, CSS, and so that's why these tutorials are existing, is because it's a slightly different take on you than say a series on how to do web design or something like that, right? We're not making functional sites in this tutorial series. It's meant to be, kind of ridiculous. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, in order to add CSS, there's a couple things we need to do. First, you'll note I've already created this test.css file, but I'm just going to go ahead and create a new file. And I'm going to call it style.css. That's really pretty mundane. And if I do that, you'll see that it puts this hashtag in front of it, which is kind of the shorthand sign for CSS. And it creates a new file that has absolutely nothing in it. So one of the things that we have to do in order for anything that we do in this style.css document to be applied to our index or our page 1 or page 2 or wherever we want it applied, is we need to tell the browser, when the browser comes and starts reading this file, that it needs to link to another page in order to get that style, in order to essentially get that style information so that it can be applied to our different different elements on the page. And so what we're going to do is below where I'm just using the same index from the last tutorial, but below where we have doc type HTML and HTML, we're going to tab over once, and we're going to create a tag we haven't talked about yet, just called head. And what head does is, if you have any JavaScript or any other files that need to be essentially accessed to make your page functional, you put those links in the head. Now, there's other elements that will get placed in here, but we're not going to worry about those yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create what's called a link tag, right? And with the link tag, there's a couple of parameters or attributes that we need to add to this in order to make sure that we access the correct file. The first thing we need to do is tell it what kind of file it's going to be looking for. And so it's not the file name, but it's the file type. And so we're going to type rel equals, and then double quotes. And we're going to type in all lowercase style.css. sheet. Then we need a space, and we're going to type in href, which, right, if you look down below, that's the same attribute or element that we used in order to reference the location of an HTML file. So we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to say href and then equals and double quote. And then we want to make sure, again, this is all lowercase. And I'm just going to type in style.css. And then I'm going to go ahead and do a closing caret on the other end of this. So what this does is this will allow us to now reference this style sheet. Now currently our style sheet has nothing in it, so it's not going to make any changes whatsoever, but we're going to fix that in just a little bit. Now there's something we haven't talked about yet, which is something that if you've done any programming before, you know is a possibility, and if you haven't, you'll be glad is a possibility. There is one other element I want to introduce that's called a comment. And what a comment is it's basically something that the computer will ignore, which anything that comes after it, which means that you can leave notes to yourself in the text document so you can remember what things do. So if I hold down, okay, so if I do an open caret, an exclamation point, and 2 dashes, what that's going to do is it's going to create a comment. And in this case, the comments are highlighted in green. And I can just write anything in here. So I can say, right, this is required, right, to reference CSS file, right? So this is right? And so if I was to save this and come back over here and refresh my page, you're not going to see any difference because, right, that text is not getting placed on the page. However, if I was to say delete those first 2 characters there and then save this and then refresh this, right, now you can see that that is popping up at the very top of the page because it's the very first thing on there. And so I'm going to go ahead and put those back, right, so it disappears. But so this is a comment, right, and this is, at least in HTML documents, this is one of the ways that you can create inline comments. And I think you can actually have this be multiple lines as long as, right, you terminate it with the 2 dashes and that closing caret. Okay, so we've got our style sheet referenced. So how the heck do we write CSS code? Which really, it's not so much code as all it is it's a list of parameters that we apply to each one of our tags, and essentially what value those parameters should have. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to tell it what tag we are going to be applying style to. And so to start with, you want to type in the tag. And our first tag we're going to be interested in styling is the body. So I'm just going to type in body, a space, and then what I need to do is I need to do an opening squiggly bracket, which will do a closing squiggly bracket as well, and then I can hit enter to create that new line. Then once I've done that, what I need to do is I need to have some parameter in here that I want to change. And in my case, I want to change the background color. And in CSS, the way we change the background color is by typing in the word. If I just type in background color is my first option. Now I want you to note there are a lot of options in here. And right, there's just a ton of, background things. Notice we can put background images in, we can do background position, we can do a repeat. So if we have a small image, we can essentially use that as a pattern for the background. We can adjust size. There's all sorts of options that we've got there. But let's go ahead and we're just going to stick with background color. So I'm just going to click on that. And you'll see the syntax is that I say background color, I do a colon, and then I choose the color that I want to use. And you'll see then I end the line with a semicolon. And what's nice is that VS Code does all of this for us. So we don't have to worry about remembering the colon or the semicolon or anything else. So I want my background color to be, and you can see there's all these color names, and these are the hexadecimal values. There's also a really nice feature in here that we'll see in just a second. I want this to be dark sea green. It doesn't matter. You can choose whatever color you want. Ooh, deep pink, that's going to be ugly. Let's do that. Right, so I've got deep pink set as my color. Now, something that that VS Code does when you're working in CSS style sheet is it allows you to hover over this dot, and then you can get into this color picker, and you can choose any color that you want, right? Right now it's just deep pink, but I can come over here and I could, you know, pull this over to adjust the hue, right, and make it blue, or, you know, make it green or teal. And right, and that will adjust that color, right? It makes it a lot simpler than having to go somewhere else to figure out what these RGB color values should be, right? That's what this little function does, is it basically sets the red, the green, and the blue color values based on a scale of 0 to 255. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this file, and let's make sure, yep, index has been saved. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh this. And now, right, my color, my background color is this beautiful, beautiful teal. Okay, so I've styled the body. Now let's go to our index and let's look at the other tags we've got. So the title tag, I'm honest, I don't think there's much styling you can do there because it's going to be based on what the web browser, how it formats the text. But anything that's within the body we can style. So paragraphs we can style. If I have a heading in here, you could go ahead and put a heading in yours as well. The anchor tags, the image tags, we could do some styling on, although there's not a whole lot that's really going to show up, although some positioning will. And we're going to look at some other examples of tags that we can also style. Okay, so let's go ahead and keep rolling. Let's go ahead and style our paragraphs. So all I need to do is I need to create a couple spaces. I hit P, I do the opening squiggly bracket, hit enter, and then anything that I want to modify on the paragraph, I'm going to put between these two. So you can think about this as just sort of a container, and then just a list of all the different parameters that I could possibly change. So let's go ahead and what should we set here? Let's set the font, right? So right now we're using the default serif font in our file. So one of the things we can do very generally is, rather than setting a specific font, which we can do as well, we can also set a font family, right? So we can either basically say, you know, maybe you want to use a particular font like Helvetica that is sans serif, and you know, or Veranda, or, you know, there's a ton of different possible options, right? But by the way, if you don't know, serifs are fonts that are serif fonts have the little kind of feet and balls and headings, whereas sans serif don't have any of these little detailings on the edges, and they're typically easier to read on the screen. So if I type in if I type in font dash family, and right now I have all of these possible font families. Now what's nice about this is these are all what are called web safe fonts. They're things that every browser already has and knows how to render. You can also include your own custom fonts and web fonts, and we'll get into that later. But you can kind of see that there's this list, right? I have no idea what cursive or fantasy is, but we could do some, I'm sure it'll be amazing. So let's go ahead and do something that is sans. So we'll just say, let's just do Gill sans. Now, what I want you to note is that if there is a problem, what the way CSS works is with this font families, it says, okay, first, let's try and do Gill sans. If for some reason Gill sans doesn't exist, let's try and do Gill sans MT, which is Microsoft's version. And if that doesn't work, then we'll try and do Calibri, and then we'll do Trebuchet MS, and then, you know what, we'll just try and do something that's sans serif, right, in the end. And so that's how this works, right? It gives you this whole list of possible options. If we wanted to have it be Calibri, we could always just, cut this from here and paste it in front of Gil Sans and make sure that we just have commas around our things. And you'll note some of these require single quotes around them. For some reason, Calibri does not. I don't know why that is. So I'm going to go ahead and render this. And you'll note that, right, my heading has not changed because it's a heading, not a paragraph. But the text around the body of this image has changed. Let's go ahead and create some more text in one of our paragraphs. In fact, why don't we just go ahead and create a new paragraph under the second image where we can do this. And so I'm just going to write some nonsensical gobbledygook and do a page break, or a line break. So open caret BR, close caret, and then hit enter. And then just do some more text as well with some spaces in it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm going to refresh this so we have a bit more text, right? So now you can see that I've changed the font. I've got it set in this paragraph. And let's go ahead and style some of the other things. So what's nice about all this code completion is, even though we don't know anything, and I actually have to come to the end of the line, usually if you have a smaller font in here, your life will be a lot better. But we don't know anything about, what options are available. But even if we hit one letter, we can see all sorts of interesting things like animation, timing function, and duration. That's something we'll get to in a little bit. So if I type in the letter S, you can see that, oh, I can do a stroke or stroke width or dash or size. There's all sorts of interesting things that we can do. So, but what we're going to do is we're going to just type in F for font again. And we are going to say, let's do font size. So font size, we have several options here, right? We can say large, larger, medium, small, smaller, extra large. Right, so there's some keywords that will set fonts to a particular size on the page. We can set fonts in all sorts of different measurement units as well. We can set it in centimeters, we can set it in a percentage, millimeters, inches, pixels. We have a huge range of possibilities for how we reference the size of this font. For now, let's just go ahead and say we want this to be extra large. I have no idea what that's going to look like. Now, for some reason, I don't see this other caret, so this may break, or this other squiggly bracket. So this may not work. Oh, no, it still worked. And it may be working because, oh, okay, there we go. Because I was too far over. I didn't go all the way back over to the last thing. Okay, right, so now that text is extra large. We could also, if we wanted it to be a particular pixel size, we could say 200 px. And if I save this and go ahead and refresh this, oh, maybe I have to do it as, let's try this. There we go. The px there, you don't want the space, right? So that was my issue there, right? So now I have text that is absolutely enormous. We can do it as a percentage as well. So if I just say, I have no idea what 100% is going to do for me in this setting. So let's go ahead and save this, and let's go ahead and refresh this. All right, so 100% looks like it's the default size for the browser. If I do 400%, and I refresh it over here, right now it's 400% the standard size for text on the screen in this browser. And right, it doesn't adjust in scale when I scale the browser window. It just moves the text around. Okay, right, so there's a ton of different ways that we can reference font size. I'm going to go ahead and leave this at 400% because I'm making a really, really ugly site, and it's it's making me happy. All right, so we've got the font family, we've got font size. Something else we can do is we can do alignment. So if we say text align, and you'll notice there's a lot of options here. But if we say text align center and go ahead and save this and then refresh, right? And if I have this web browser a little bit wider, you'll see that at least on the lines where things are set, you'll also notice, right, this image is centered now, right? Because it's in a paragraph and it's treated as an inline element, which means it's treated as though it is text. So it gets shifted over halfway because I have this text align centered. Now, in order to comment something out in CSS, what you need to do is you'd use the backslash and a star or a asterisk, and then asterisk and backslash on the other side, and that will comment something out. So if I want to temporarily disable one of these things because maybe I did something and it really broke my site, right? Now I've temporarily disabled that, so now I can see, oh yeah, his head did shift back over and all the way to the left side of the screen, right? By default, everything is aligned to the left. If I go ahead and take this comment out and change this to right, oops, it should be lowercase r, and I go ahead and save this and I render this again, right? Now everything is going to be aligned to the right side of the window. Okay. All right. So the other things we can do in terms of text, if I go ahead, come down here and I say font dash weight, this is how I basically can numerically set how bold or thin a font should be, or light, I guess is what they call it. So if I set this to 100 and I save this and I come in here and render this, you'll see that the font is significantly thinner and honestly more elegant looking than it was before. If I change this to 900, which is, I believe, the maximum value you can give it, the text is going to be substantially thicker. Right? So we can numerically adjust the weight of the font. The other option, if I delete this and type in B, right, there's bold or bolder, or L, lighter, right? So there's some keywords that, predefine certain weights of the font as well. So one thing I would like you to do is to just go through and kind of experiment with a few of these options, right? There's certain things that are not, that if you're just going hard at some of these, like grid, we're not using grids, it's not going to make any difference. But anything font based, you can also do text align, right? Text decoration. We'll talk about transforms and transitions later. Notice there's text indent. You can adjust tab sizes. There's all sorts of different possible options. Now, there is something to talk about while I have this open. You'll see that in some of these, there's this -O, or there's a -MS, or there's a -MOZ, and then finally down below, there's a -WebKit. Each one of those means that these are special commands that are for either Firefox, which is made by Mozilla. MS would be anything, it would be Edge, which is made by Microsoft. O is for Opera, which I don't know if any of you have ever used, but it's another browser out there. And then WebKit is for Chrome and Safari. And so these are things where they haven't been fully integrated into the standard set of CSS commands, which is like got to be a nightmarish process of people trying to submit changes and get it all to work evenly across all browsers. And so these are fixes that will, or things that are being tested that might work in one browser but are not going to work in the other. And so basically, if you have this Mozilla transition duration property or whatever, when your browser's Safari and it sees this, it's just going to ignore it as though it's going to say, oh, Moz, I'm not going to do that because it's not going to work. And this is one of the things with web design stuff, is that the browsers are reasonably equivalent in how they render things, but they don't support everything the same. For our projects in this course, that does not matter at all. So yeah, go ahead and experiment with this, and pause the video when you have experimented with a few more things. We're going to go ahead and look at some other ways that CSS is used. Okay, now that you've played a little bit, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about CSS and styling and layout a little bit, and talk about what's called the CSS box model. And to do that, we're going to create a new page. Now, to save ourselves a new HTML page. Now, to save ourselves some work, one thing we can do is we can go ahead and right-click on the index.html file. We can go down to Copy, and then we can just click off in space here and right-click again and go to Paste. Right? And now I've got this index copy.html, and once I've done that, let's go ahead and just change this. I'm going to right-click on it, and I'm going to go down to Rename. And I'm going to rename this to I'm just going to call it Box Model, right? So we know what page this is referencing. Now, it's going to look exactly the same as the previous page at this point. But let's go ahead and change our title up here to Box Model Example. And then we don't really need our different pages here. What we can do is any of these links or anything, we're just going to go ahead and get rid of everything inside the body for the time being. Right? The reason we've kept all of this around, though, is because we're going to use the same style sheet. So if I go ahead and save this and then come over here, and at the end of this incredibly long file name here, I can go and I could either click on the debug thing, or I can come in here and I can just type in box model and then hit enter. And it should just be a blank teal page in my case, unless your color is different. Now that I've done that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce something called a div. And a div is basically just literally a division of your page. Now, in order to see something in here, I'm going to go ahead and call this, I'm going to put some text in here. I'm going to call it div, just div1. And let's go ahead and do div2 and div3. So I'll just make another div. And granted, I could have copied and pasted this. I'm just going to say div2. And then why don't I just go ahead and copy and paste those 3 lines. And then make this div3. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and save this and refresh my browser, and you'll see that I have div1, div2, div3. It's pretty exciting stuff here. So now what I need to do is I'm going to go to CSS, and we're going to define some things, and then we're going to talk about what we've done. So I'm going to come down below the last opening bracket, and I might actually delete this line so it's a little bit tighter there. There we go. And I'm going to type in div, and then opening squiggly bracket, and hit enter. And the different things I want to do is I want to change, there's one setting we should already know, which is background color. And I'm going to go ahead and set this to deep pink. And now I'm going to go ahead and save this. And when if I come over here and refresh, you'll see that, I suddenly have this pink box that seems to be wrapped around all 3 of these different elements. However, it's actually around each one of those individual elements. So I've got this background color, deep pink, but there's some other things that we need to adjust. One of them is the width. So if I type in width and I do a colon, you'll see that there are a ton of, again, different ways in which we can set the width. Percentage, which is percentage of the parent object, which we'll talk about that later. It's not that important for what we're doing, but we're just going to go ahead and go with pixels at this point. And then I'm going to do a semicolon. And I don't want it to be 0 pixels. Let's go ahead and just make it 300 pixels. I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm going to come back over here. I'm going to render. So now you'll see that it's actually chopped this off, right? So that this is only 300 pixels wide. And now we need to set some other variables. So we need to set our margins as well. And if I just say margin and I hit enter, what this does is it sets the space around the different divisions. So I'm going to set this to, for now, 10px. If I go ahead and save this and I render this, and I render this, now you'll see, right, that it's splitting this up, and there's actually 20 pixels between each of these elements because there's 10 on the bottom here and 10 on the top of this one, and then 10 on the bottom, 10 on the top. And you'll note that it's also pushed this over 10 pixels, and there's actually a 10 pixel buffer if we had some other elements in here on the other side of this. Okay, so we've got our margin. So the other thing that we can do is add something called padding. Now padding, and you'll note that there are all sorts of different padding options as well. We'll talk about this in the end. Currently, let's just say we're just going to use the base padding. I'm going to click on this, and then I'm going to use pixels again because it's just an easy reference, and I'm going to set the padding to 20 pixels. Now what the padding does is the padding is the space between the edge of this division and the whatever content is in that division. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to refresh this. Right. So now you can see I've got this text right with 20 pixels of padding on the top and 20 pixels of padding on the bottom. And then it looks like I've got a margin of 10 pixels in between there. And you'll note that it looks a little bit off, and I'm probably misrepresenting. This may actually overlap the 10 pixels of the margin that's on top and bottom, but which is kind of interesting. Okay, so I've got my padding, I've got my width, I've got my margin. The other thing that I can add in here, and I'm putting these in a particular order. So I'm saying margin because that's the outside, that's outside the object. Then the boundary between the margins and the object itself can be defined with a border. So I can type in border, and note there's again a lot of things we can do there. But I'm going to go ahead and just say border. And when I say border, there's a couple settings I need to do. So first I need to tell it how big the border should be. And we are going to let's just say we want this to, again, be 10 pixels. And so, okay, so I'm going to say border. I'm going to do cornflower blue. Now, if I go ahead and render this, nothing's going to happen. And that might be because I failed to save it. But nothing's going to happen. Now, why is nothing happening? None of this changes because, right, this isn't everything that's needed. There's one other word that's needed in here. I need to tell it what type of border this is. In our case, we're going to start by making it a solid border. Then the following thing, that cornflower blue, the color, can come after that. So if I go ahead and save this, I go ahead and render this, now you'll see that I've created a 10 pixel border around my division that has its padding, right? And these are separated by margins. So, okay, let's see here. So with that, if I do not include the color information and just go ahead and save this and render it, the border by default is going to be black. Now, the other thing you can do is you can pretty quickly just type in dashed instead of solid. Let me make sure I delete that. There we go. If I save this and render this, then I get a dashed line as the border. Now, I want you to note that when you do that, right, at least by default, the border is on the inside of the division, and so it actually still has that background color that's applied to the division. So let's go ahead and maybe make this cornflower blue again, or corn silk, or whatever you want it to be. This is your page. You can do what you want with it. Okay, so I've got 3 of these divisions set up with all of these different settings, which is pretty cool. This is, right, you can very quickly see how you can make, simple, okay. So let's say that you hate square corners and you want to round your corners. The way you can do that is by typing in border dash radius. And then we can set that again in pixels or whatever we want. And let's go ahead and make it 5. And I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to bring this over. I'm going to render this. And you can see it's kind of hard to see here, but those are now bent. If I go ahead and make this, say, 20, and save it and bring this in, right, I'm going to get a substantially different result, right? This is going to curve, very much. And if I go ahead and the dashes don't look so great right now, I'm sure there's a way to fix that, but I'm just going to go back to solid as the type of border. I'm going to go ahead and save that. I'm going to go ahead and render this. All right, there. So now I've got those rounded corners on my divisions. Okay, so there's some other things we can do to align divisions. Now, one of the things is if I have my margin set to 10 here, right, this is my overarching margin for the entire area. If I just go to, say, margin, and I type in the keyword auto, I go ahead and save this, and come back over here and render this, what it's going to do is it's going to, right, the top and bottom, it's all smushed together, but it's going to go ahead and center this in the page. And what's nice about that is if I actually adjust the width of this, it stays centered in the page, right? And it's set to, and for whatever reason, Chrome only goes so small. But, right, so this is a nice way of aligning things. Now you'll notice that I currently have auto. So let's go ahead and, right, say we don't want these to be the same. Let's say we want the margin on the left to be automatic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this. I'm going to say margin dash left. And then I'm just going to say auto. But I want the, right, and so if I save this and I come back here and I render this, right, it's going to automatically push, right, what it's going to do is it essentially does the same thing as aligning this to the right side of the screen, right, because it's saying this is automatic and this should be whatever the default is. So if I want to make it so that it's centered again, but that I can have a differing space on the top and bottom, then what I can do is I now say margin dash right colon auto semicolon. I save this, I come back over here and I render this, right, and I get that same result. But now I can go in and I can just say margin dash top, and I can say, let's just say 80 px, something big. I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to come back over here. I'm going to render this. Right? And so now those are all aligned in the center, but I've got a lot more space between my different divisions. Now, currently, we only have these 3 divisions, and we only have a little bit of text in there. Let's go ahead and throw one of our images in each one of our divisions. So let's go ahead. Now I've added a bunch of images here we're not going to worry about yet, but I'm going to use this man small PNG. If you have whatever image you downloaded, will be fine. But that's going to be my base object. So I'm going to go back to the box model.html. And in this division 1, I'm going to go ahead and just say, I'm going to create an img tag. And I'm going to say src for source. And remember it was, I don't even remember the name of the file. It was man-small png. Okay, so for me it's man-small.png. And then the other thing I can add in here is the width and the height. Now, that's something else I can do in CSS as well, and it really depends on if you like where you want to have it. But I'm going to say width. I'm just going to do this numerically here. Actually, I just want to see how big it is before I do anything. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to render this. Oh, and it does not find it. Why didn't it find it? Because, right, it's in this images folder. So I need to say images, \, right? And then it pops up all of these different options. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to come back over here and just note that's right, the broken image. That means that somehow I made a mistake and it's not finding it. That actually looks pretty great. Okay, so I'm going to leave it the default size. I don't need to worry about width and height. But let's go ahead and in this next one, we're going to make it a little smaller. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. I'm going to paste this in div 2. And this time, let's go ahead and set the width and height here. So I'm going to say width is equal to, and in HTML, you do not need the px. It just assumes you mean pixels. So I'm going to set the width equal to 100 pixels, and then I'm going to do a space and do height, and then say equal again. Let's just say 100 pixels. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to come in here, I'm going to render this, right? And so now I've got, right, the full size, and I've got this much smaller version in the other option. I do want you to note, right, that this one appears to be centered, and that's because, right, it just happens to be about the right size to fill in the width, to sit nicely in the width of this div. So let's go ahead and do, let's go ahead and make this, let's go ahead and copy and paste this one more time for our third div. And what we're going to do this time is, oh, I should have copied. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and copy it here. And I'm going to go ahead and paste it here. And I just want to see what happens if I make this 400, because I know that my div is supposed to only be 300 pixels wide, right? I believe that's what we set. If I save this and I pop back over to my style.css, I come down here to my width. Yes, it's 300 pixels. So let's go ahead and refresh this, right? And so you'll see that because I set this to 400 pixels wide, right? He's pushed off from the side here, and his ear is actually overlapping the edge of the div. Now, if I made this even larger, so if I went to boxmodel.html and I said, okay, let's just make this 800 in width, which should also be kind of hilarious, because it should deform his face. Yeah, there we go. Right, so it's deformed his face. It's set the width to 800, so it's completely offset from the position, right? It's not confined in the div. The div does not grow with his face, right? It's all, because we've hard-coded these things, he is just going to be floating off here in space with his wide face. So let's go ahead and see some other ways that we can modify these things. Now, so one of the things we can do is let's go ahead and go to our style sheet. So we've styled body, we've styled the paragraph, we've styled the div. Let's go ahead and try and style the image tag. So I'm going to type in img, and I'm going to go ahead and create my squiggly brackets. And the first thing I want to do is I'm just going to type in align, colon, center, and comma. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And you'll see there's a squiggly thing on here. That's an unknown property. So let's go ahead and see what, if anything, under A is able. It says align self, align items, but azimuth is not an option. Align tracks, right? But this align is not possible. What if I do T? If I do text align and say center and save this and come in here and render this, refresh this, that did not change it. there's something wrong with using align or using text align, right? That's not working for this. And so how do we fix this? How do we make it so we can actually say, well, I want this image to be really small, and I want it to be in the center of this box. And that's also going to align all three of these, by the way, because it's applying to every single image tag. So let's go ahead and delete that line. That's not going to help us. What we need to do is we need to change the display type. Now, I've said this a few times in the tutorials already, but there are a couple different, there's several different types of display. You can see that as we go down, right, there's a lot. But so the two most frequently used are inline and block. Inline is, right, when I was talking about how images are treated as text, right, they're an inline element. That's also, other inline things are bold tags or italics tags or strike through tags. Those are all inline elements, whereas a div is a block element. Right? And so what we can do is we can use CSS to say, well, I want this image to be treated as a block element. So I have created block and I've hit semicolon. And now what I can do is I can set it up like I would set up, like I would align a div. Now, and we're going to talk about where this is being aligned to here in a second. If I go ahead and copy margin left auto, margin right auto, I come down here and I paste those into my image and I save this. And I come over here and I refresh this. Now my images are centered. Now this image, you'll notice, right, is still off-centered. And that's because it's just so huge. But the other two images, this one moved a little bit and this one moved substantially. And the way this works is rather than this margin being halfway between the edge of the page and the edge of the page, the way that HTML and CSS works is they're sort of the objects are nested in each other. So if I go to my HTML page, right? So the divs are nested within the body, and so the body is determining is basically the container for the div tags. And so the div tags are have auto margins aligned to the size of the body. Now the body size changes dynamically when the window size changes, right? That's just a common way that browsers tend to function and HTML tends to function unless you very specifically tell it not to do that. However, right, so that's the container, but the parent or the container for the image tag are these div tags. And so, okay, so the image is nested within this, inside this, right? It's, even though it sticks out sometimes, its container is technically the div tag that's associated with. So so we can test that by adjusting one of these margins. Now, something that sometimes happens, and I'm just going to go ahead and change my margin left to 0px and save this. And I'm going to go ahead and refresh this. Now, it snapped over to the side here appropriately, right? And if I move this around, they're staying over there because I set that margin to 0. But you'll note that these are still centered inside their elements. They're just no longer centered with inside the parent level, the document level object. Okay, so however, when I was just testing this and I brought this back to auto and I hit save and I refreshed this, it nudged a little bit, but it's not centered like it's supposed to be. And part of that is because for whatever reason, at least with Chrome right now, this is not, there's a scroll bar here at the bottom. And if I go ahead and start to adjust this, then it will stay centered no matter what size I make it. So that's just something to notice. Sometimes things don't appear to have been applied, and you just need to make sure that this is this is accurately updated. Okay, so we're using this to set this. Now, the other thing we can do is we can actually set our width and height within our CSS document. So instead of doing this on each one of these items, I can set it here. So if I just say, let's just say 200px is my width, and I'm going to go down here and say height. and I'm going to say 200 px. I'm going to save this and come back in here. I'm going to render this, and you'll note that even though the HTML document still has different widths and heights for these three items, they are being overwritten and overridden, by the image tags styling sheet. So that's something to be aware of. If you have conflicting things, the CSS is what's going to take it away. What's nice about this is, instead of having to go in here in my HTML file and have the width and height set in each one of these places, if I want them all to be the same height, I can very quickly set this up. Now, one thing you may be asking yourself is, well, what happens if I want this first one to be pink, this second one to be yellow, and this third one to be green? How do I make that happen? Well, we're going to cover that just right now. So something you can do in CSS is you can have something called a selector. And there's something called a class selector that very specifically deals with, that is the first type we're going to work with. And what a class selector does is you basically define a special class, and then it will, and then in your HTML document, you make a note that this div should be, this particular class, and it will apply those modifications to that class. So let's go ahead and, we've got our primary div tag. Now we can do classes in two ways. We can have a generic class where you could basically label any element in your HTML document with that class, and it will apply those settings to it. Those can be really helpful, but you can also create classes that are specific to a type of tag. So I can come in here and I can say div dot, let's call one, well, we're going to just leave the top one as the default, but let's call this one div dot, let's just call it green. And then we will create an opening and closing bracket. And the only value in here we're going to change is our background color. And we can say background color. And let's just do, we called it green. We should probably do some sort of green, yeah? Ooh, yeah, green, yellow, that'll be ugly as sin. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and, let's go ahead and save this with this one change. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here and I'm going to go to my box model. And in this div tag here, in the first one, it's not going to have any class. It's classless or not classy. But this middle one here, I'm going to go ahead and hit space, and I'm going to type in the word class, then the equal sign, double quote, and the class that I want to use is green. I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm going to make sure my style sheet was saved as well. I'm going to come back in here, and I'm going to go ahead and render this. And so now I've been able to set the background color of this center div to green, right? And this one's pink. This one also does not have any value whatsoever. So let's go ahead and create another class to apply to this third one. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, and I'm just going to say a couple times, so there's a little bit of space there. I'm going to say div, and we'll just say div dot hard, because we're going to make this have hard corners. And I'm going to do opening and closing things. And let's go ahead and copy this, the background color, and paste it in here. And instead of green, yellow, you can choose some other color. Now, something to note, there is an opacity slider here, and we'll talk about that later. But right now, I'm just going to make this a blue. And then the other value that I want to change is I want the border radius to be 0. So I'm going to go ahead and just type in border dash radius colon 0 px, right? Because 0 pixels is basically going to mean that, right, it should be a hard corner, right? The higher this number is, the more round the corners are. So if I go ahead and save this, come back over here and refresh. Oh, nothing happened. And nothing happened because I forgot to update this to just create that class, or to say this third div should have a class equal to card. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And now I'm going to go ahead and refresh this. And there we go, right? It's changed the layout to this nice pale blue, and it's given me nice, hard, crisp corners on this div. Right, so this is the power of CSS. Now, there's a lot more that we can do with this, and in the next tutorial, we're actually going to talk a lot about positioning, and we're going to be using a bunch of these marine invertebrate images that I've got here to, and actually be using CSS to position all of these on top of each other, talk about opacity, and talk about how we can, how you can make sure the objects are in the correct order. Okay. So that's all we have for this tutorial. Hopefully you now have a little bit better grasp on style. There is one last thing I want to tell you, which is you should definitely go to the w3schools.com CSS page. They have tutorials that you can do, but if you're wondering about all the different possible things you can do, there are a ton of things here, including some of which we'll get to, but gradients, shadows, text effects. You can actually do transforms, aka rotations of CSS elements, and we're going to get into that when we do the next step. You can do animations. There's all sorts of amazing things that can be done with this, and they have everything kind of laid out in a pretty quick format where hopefully after seeing this tutorial and just a little introduction, you can get some sense of how to do these things. They also have this nice try it yourself setting where you can try it, but it's oftentimes easier to do this actually in VS Code because of all the code completion if you want to know what other types of alignment you can do and things like that. Okay, that's the end of the tutorial.